In this video on trigonometry, we're looking at angles between 0 and 360, so taking in all 4 quadrants of the unit circle. So let's start by reminding ourselves what our unit circles look like. There's 2 that we've had to learn off, so pause the video here while you draw them yourself and then play and see if you're correct. So here's our skeleton unit circles, if you like. Let's just remind ourselves first of all about our angle positions and the names of the quadrants. And just note that a full rotation of 360 brings me back to the same position as 0 degrees. And our quadrants go around anti-clockwise, starting here at the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th. Okay, so in my first diagram, I'm going to put in what's positive where. So I've filled in CAST, cos is positive, it's the only one positive in the 4th quadrant. All are positive in the 1st quadrant, only sine is positive in the 2nd, and only tan is positive in the 3rd quadrant. Now let's think about our reference angles for this 2nd unit circle. Well, the reference angle itself is positioned in the 1st quadrant. In the 2nd quadrant, we can calculate an angle by saying 180, take the reference angle. In the 3rd quadrant, it's 180 plus the reference angle. And in the 4th quadrant, it's 360, take the reference angle. So in previous lessons, we were looking at a situation where we were just given one trigonometric ratio, a sine or a cos or a tan to work with. And in this video, I'm going to be looking at questions where we're given more than one piece of information. And we have to work out then what our answer is from there. So let's have a look at an example. So let's start off with something nice and straightforward. In this question, we're being asked, in which quadrant do we have positive cos and positive sine? Now, what can be a really good idea for a question like this is to draw a quick sketch, first of all, of your unit circle. And it's just the first diagram that I need really, because I'm not given any values in this question, so I don't need to work anything out as such. I just need to decide which quadrant I'm talking about. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tick the quadrants that apply for both cases. So where do I have positive cos values first of all? Well, I know that everything is positive in the 1st quadrant, so cos is definitely positive there. And also cos is positive in the 4th quadrant. So both of those quadrants have positive cos. Now I need to consider the situation of positive sine. So again, I note that everything's positive in the 1st quadrant, so I've definitely got positive sine in there, and sine is also positive in the 2nd quadrant. Now I'm looking for one quadrant that has both positive cos and positive sine. So I just look for the quadrant that has a tick from both. And obviously in this case, that's the 1st quadrant. So my answer is just the 1st quadrant. So here's one to do yourself. So your question is, in which quadrant is sine negative and cos negative? So pause the video here, take a moment to do this, and then see if you're correct. Okay, so again, I want to draw a quick sketch to help me out. Okay, so this time I need to first of all note which quadrants have negative sine, and then separately which have negative cos, and then we'll see which ones get ticked for both. So sine is negative where? Well, it's positive here and here in the 1st and 2nd, so it must be negative in the 3rd and 4th. So I'll tick those for sine being negative. And then let's see where cos is negative. Well, cos is positive in the 1st and 4th, so it's negative in the 2nd and 3rd. So the quadrant where both sine and cos are negative must be the 3rd quadrant here. My next example is going to be a little bit of a variation on this, just written in a slightly different way. So in the 2nd example, I want to know in which quadrant is sine less than 0 and tan less than 0. Now this is actually the exact same type of question as the last example in question. It's just written a little bit differently. And just note here, when I say that something is less than 0, I mean that it's negative. So really what this question is asking me is in which quadrant is sine negative and tan negative. So if you're confident about this, pause the video here and try that yourself, and then play and see if you're correct. So again, I draw my quick sketch of my unit circle, and then I'm going to indicate in which quadrants sine is negative. So sine is positive in the 1st and 2nd, so it must be negative in the 3rd and 4th. And then I'm going to consider tan. So tan is positive in the 1st and 3rd, so it must be negative in the 2nd and 4th. And now I can just check and see which quadrant has a tick for both, and obviously here it's the 4th quadrant. And now a question for you. So your question is, in which quadrant is tan less than 0 and cos greater than 0? So pause the video here, try this yourself, and then play and see if you're correct. Okay, so I've drawn my unit circle as a reference, and then I've got to mark where tan is less than 0. So where is tan negative? So tan is negative, well, it's positive in the first and third quadrants. So it must be negative in the second and fourth quadrants. And then I need to look for where cos is greater than 0. Well, now if less than 0 is negative, well then greater than 0 must be positive. So I go to my unit circle and I'm marking where cos is positive. So cos is positive in the first quadrant because everything's positive in there, and it's positive in the fourth quadrant as well. So in this case, my answer must be the fourth quadrant. So now we're going to use this technique to find an angle. So here's our example question. I want to find theta if sine theta is -1/2 and cos theta is √3/2. Now, the first thing to notice here is that the sine value is negative and the cos value is positive. So I need to take both of these facts into account when determining which quadrant theta is in. And this is just exactly what we've been doing before in the previous examples. So I'll start by drawing a quick unit circle. Do this yourself as well and see if you can determine which quadrant I want to focus on. Okay, so I've sketched my unit circle and now I'll establish which quadrant I want to focus on for my answer. So I'm looking at sine being negative. So where is sine negative? Well, it's positive in the first and second, so it must be negative in the third and fourth. And then I want to also have a think about where cos is positive. Well, cos is positive in the first quadrant because everything's positive there, and it's positive in the fourth quadrant. So the fourth quadrant is where I want to focus on. Now that I've narrowed it down to my quadrant, I'm going to figure out my reference angle. And to do this, I only need to use one of my two ratios here. I can use the sine or I can use the cos. I don't actually have to use both. And the reason for that is that both give me the same answer. I'm going to use sine, but you can just as easily use cos. So for this, what I do is I look at my ratio. In this case, I'm looking at sine theta. And I say that, well, this particular angle has the same sign as an angle in the first quadrant. So I'm going to say that that's the reference angle. So I'm going to say sine r equals 2, and then I'm going to ignore the negative part of that and just say sine r equals 1/2. I'm then going to use this to work out the reference angle, and I can do that with my log tables. So if I go to my log tables, I can see that sine is 1/2 at 30 degrees. So my reference angle is 30 degrees. I now want to work out what angle in the fourth quadrant that relates to. So the first thing I'll need to do is just sketch my other unit circle relating to reference angles. So I have that unit circle now, and I know that I'm looking at the fourth quadrant. So I'm going to use 360 minus my reference angle. So in this case, theta equals 360 minus r. And since I know that r is 30, that means it's 360 minus 30. So my angle is 330 degrees. Note that I only have one solution because the fact that I had two pieces of information, I had two trig ratios, allowed me to narrow my answer down into one quadrant to get just one value of theta. Okay, so now a question for you. So your question is to find theta if sine theta equals 1/√2 and tan theta equals -1. So pause the video here while you go about that and then play and see if you're correct. Okay, so let's run through our solution here. So the first thing to do is to narrow down where we're looking in our unit circle. And we'll do that by looking at our sine and tan. So notice here that my sine is positive and my tan is negative. So I'm going to sketch a unit circle to narrow down the quadrant that's actually relevant. Okay, so first of all, where is sine positive? Well, sine is positive in the first quadrant and it's positive in the second quadrant as well. And now I'll find where tan is negative. Well, tan is positive in the first and third, so it must be negative then, so in the second and fourth. So I've got a double tick there in the second quadrant, so the second quadrant is the one to look at. And now that I've determined my quadrant, I want to look at my reference angle. Again, I can take either of my ratios to work this out. It doesn't matter because they should both give me the same answer. So I'm going to just go with the first one. So sine theta is 1/√2. And so what I'm going to do for the reference angle is I'm going to say that sine as a reference angle is equal to, well, it's the same value as the sine of theta. I just have to make sure it's positive. And in this case it is, there's no problem. So I can straight away just say that sine of r equals 1/√2. And then I can go to my log tables and I can look that up. And I get that my reference angle is 45 degrees. So I have the reference angle and I know which quadrant to look at, the second quadrant. So now I'm going to use my other unit circle with the reference angles to help figure out that final angle. So I've sketched that unit circle, and it's a good idea, like for every question that you do, to sketch these out each time. It'll help get it into your memory as well as helping you to get the answer to the question correct. So we're looking at the second quadrant, so that's this quadrant here. So I'm going to use 180 minus my reference angle. So in this case, that means that I'm calculating 180 minus 45. And so my final solution here is that theta is 135 degrees. And again, I was able to narrow it down to just one answer this time, again, because I was told two different trig ratios. So all the examples and questions that we've done so far have relied on us using the log tables to help us work the answers out. I'm going to do one final example in this video where we don't use our log tables, where we're able to use our calculator for finding our angles. So in this example, I want to find theta if cos of theta is minus 0.342 and sine of theta is minus 0.940, and I want to find theta to the nearest degree. So again, I'll start by checking which quadrant is relevant. Okay, so first of all, cos is negative. So let's see where that happens. Well, it's positive in the first and fourth, so it's negative in the second and third. And then I've got sine also being negative. Well, sine is positive in the first and second, so it's negative in the third and fourth. So I just want to focus in there. So in this case, on that third quadrant. Next, I'll figure out my reference angle. Again, for the reference angle, I can just go back to either of these trig ratios, either the cos theta or the sine theta, and just take the positive version of it for the reference angle. I'm going to go with the cos this time. So the cos of my reference angle is 0.342. And now I can't look this up in the log tables, obviously, but I can use my calculator to work it out. And I'll do that by finding cos inverse of 0.342. And to the nearest degree, that's 70 degrees. Now I'm not quite finished yet because I still have to find my theta. And theta's in the third quadrant. I'm going to cheat a little bit here now and just refer back up to my diagram up here. So in the third quadrant, that's going to be 180 plus r. So I'm simply going to add 70 onto 180 to get my theta. And in this case, my theta comes out as 250 degrees. Okay, one last question now, so for you. So your question is to find theta to the nearest degree if tan theta equals minus 1.192 and cos theta equals 0.643. Pause the video here while you do this and then play to see if you're correct. Okay, so I've sketched my unit circle. Now I want to establish which quadrant I want to look at. So tan has to be negative. So I'm going to have a look and say, well, tan is positive in the first and third. So it's negative in the second and fourth. And then I want to have a look at cos being positive. So cos is positive in the first quadrant and the fourth quadrant. So the double tick is in the fourth quadrant, so that's what I want to look at. Next, I'll find my reference angle. Again, to find the reference angle, I can use either of my trig ratios. It really doesn't matter which one, as long as I take the positive versions of them. So I'm just going to go with the first one. So I'm going to say the tan of theta is minus 1.192. So the tan of the reference angle is just the positive version of this 1.192. And then I'm going to use my calculator to work out the value of r. So I'll tan inverse my 1.192. And r is 50 to the nearest degree. And again, the question asked me to round to the nearest degree, so I'm happy to do that now. And then finally, I'm going to calculate my value for theta. So I know that I'm in the fourth quadrant, so I'm using theta equals 360 minus the reference angle. And I know that my reference angle is 50. So in this case, my answer to the nearest degree is 310 degrees.